This is let me just go there like that. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's fantastic to turn out for a lunchtime Geotalk. This talk has been organised by SATEG. SATEG have been very active with organising various activities, inviting speakers, field trips, workshops, etc. So if you would like to be part of the SATEG committee next year, if you're doing your MSc or PhD, then please let us know, because we will be assembling a new committee next year, at the end of this year for next year. One of the speakers that SATEG have invited is James. James has spent over 35 years in the diamond industry in a variety of leadership roles with both major and junior companies. He is currently managing director of Botswana Diamonds. He is also a technical advisor to Shifa in Israel, and previously has held leadership roles at Rockwell Diamonds, Stella Diamonds, Lucara Diamond, and African Diamonds as well, and West African Diamonds, and De Beers, where he spent over 20 years with notable appointments, including General Manager Exploration and Nicky Oppenheimer's personal assistant. James is also the founding director and chairman of the Leadership Development's non-profit organization, Common Purpose South Africa. And James holds a degree in mining exploration, geology from the Royal School of Mines at Imperial College in London, and an MBA with distinction from Durham University. James is a fellow at the Institute of Mining, Metals and Materials in the UK, the South African Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, the Geological Society of South Africa, and the Institute of Directors of South Africa. He is a chartered engineer, a chartered scientist both in the UK, and is a professional registered natural scientist in South Africa. So quite a nice resume. Thank you all for attending, and James, welcome. Delighted to have you, and we'll hand it to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen who are here at Wits, and it's wonderful to be here with you in person at Wits, and then good afternoon to those who are on the Zoom call. The presentation which the Society of Economic Geologists challenged me with, I gave them many different options in terms of presentations, was this one, which happened to be the most complicated out of all the presentations, and it was prospecting for solutions, challenges facing the South African mining industry. So I hope you'll find this interesting. I hope it engenders some questions at the end of this, and if not, hopefully when you get to the pub a bit later on, you'll start to kind of talk about it. And the message in this presentation is there is huge opportunity for you as geologists, as well as for us as South Africans. So if I look at my agenda, I'm going to look firstly at global mining trends. That's very, very important because we are part of the globe, and however we see ourselves, we've got to fit in within the globe. Global exploration trends, you'll see how important that is, and you'll see how there is a disconnect between global mining trends and global exploration trends, and why that is an opportunity for us, where we are as a South African mining industry, exploration and juniors in South Africa, and what we need to do in terms of revitalizing the industry itself, which we believe can be done. So diving straight into this, global mining trends. So this slide should not be a surprise to many of you here. We're looking at mining companies preparing to change to a low carbon, low waste, purpose-driven future. And if you look at the bar chart on the left-hand side, you'll look at the kind of things that are required for that energy transition. You look to see where we are at 2020. If we're going to achieve the sustainable development scenario, we're looking at 4 times the delivery of some of these commodities, which I'll be talking about. But if we're looking for net zero, we're looking at 6 times the amount. Moving to the slide, the graph on the right-hand side, what are these minerals? Lithium, we're looking at 42 times the consumption of current lithium if we're going to achieve the sustainable development scenario. 42 times. Graphite 25, cobalt 21, nickel 19, and rare earth 7. That just shows where the world is wanting to go from an environmental perspective and where we are currently from a minerals perspective. So I think to tee off the presentation, that just shows you the huge opportunity. What is very interesting about that is there are new geographies which are emerging. It's not necessarily your old mining environments, which have terrific gold and PGMs and coal and oil, but those countries which have those specific minerals. And if you look at copper, Chile, nickel, Indonesia, cobalt, the DRC, rare earths, China, and lithium, Australia, but very importantly too as well, where are those actually being processed? So you can see the shift to a sustainable development scenario will also mean a geographical shift in terms of those countries which are going to become very important. And you'll see later on how important South Africa is to that shift at the same time. It would be remiss of me if I didn't make one small comment in terms of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And let's hope and pray that's over shortly. And so, one can get back to normality, although there is no such thing as normality. But we can do without a non-conflict world. But Russia is a very important producer of aluminium and nickel. It is also a very important producer of gold. So with the current sanctions environment on Russia, it obviously has a major impact in terms of those commodities coming onto the world market at the moment. And if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, you can look at the very high gold price. And that's not surprising because in times of trouble or economic or military trouble, gold does tend to be a safe haven, and therefore actually prices go up. And you can see how important Russia is to those key minerals at the same time. So therein why it's good for the world if this conflict does actually resolve itself, so we can kind of get on with doing the things we need to do. So looking at the global mining industry itself, what does all of that mean in terms of some economics? Revenues are up 32%, net profits are up 127%, market caps are only up 7%, and that's chiefly because many of the mining companies are not producing all those sexy high-priced minerals. They're producing coal, for example, which is very important to provide our base energy needs in South Africa. Capital expenditures are up 18%. Dividends are up 130%. Now, if you remember one number from this slide, please just remember that number about dividends up being 130%, because there is a disconnect between that capital expenditure and exploration and what the world needs. But you'll quickly pick that up when we'll get to the slides itself. The other point I'd like to make here is a deal value has increased by 200%. And what that means is that companies are merging, companies are being taken over where there are deposits. And that's typically when juniors such as myself find something, we get met by somebody with a larger checkbook, they buy you out, they develop a mine, and that's the kind of the business process. And if we look at critical mineral deals, mostly they're around gold at the moment because there are very many gold juniors and mid-tier companies, but we certainly see that expanding into copper, lithium, and other projects. And that's good because often if you're a junior, such as the companies I run, is you have the means to do exploration and take things up the value chain, maybe perhaps the feasibility study, but you often need to work with a larger company who has a larger balance sheet and access to a larger checkbook to actually develop those deposits itself. If you're looking at market cap growth, if you remember a couple of slides ago, I talked about your average market cap growth was 7%. So if you look at the Anglo-Americans and the Vales, the Rio Tintos, I'm not naming them, they just happen to be some of the largest mining companies in the world, incredibly diversified. And that's good because it's not always going to be the time where these commodities are rising so strongly. But if you are in one of these commodities, be it lithium, rare earth, or graphite, just look at your market capitalization appreciation. With lithium having spiked at 56%, and rare earths at 154%. So you can imagine if you are a rare earth explorer and you find something good, how much share appreciation that would actually give to your shareholders. Now, let's just take a deep breath. Now you've got the world picture. We're moving towards a sustainable development scenario in order to save our planet, and it's really, really important. And most countries around the world have signed off on it. But you look how much we need in terms of lithium, cobalt, graphite, and all of that. Now you're going to be surprised. Global exploration trends. Look at this. We are still far, far below our 2012 peak of exploration funding. Without exploration, you're not going to find these things. I think that's obvious. I just hope that some of the bankers around the world in London, New York, Johannesburg, and elsewhere have kind of actually got to this. You are seeing an increase from 2020. It is off a fairly low base, and obviously 2020 was strongly affected due to COVID. And you are seeing small incremental increases. But in order to achieve those 40 times growth phase, you've got to do a lot more than just have an incremental increase. So we are hoping this will lead to a stronger rebound going into 2023 and beyond. Where is that money being spent? Just bear in mind the slide I gave you a moment ago in terms of which geographies are going to be important going into the future with the critical minerals. Well, Latin America is going up, unsurprisingly. Canada and Australia are going up very, very strongly. Not necessarily the most prospective geologically countries in the world to go to, but countries which are very easy to work in, countries where you are incentivized to explore. So very, very friendly governments. United States has always been a bit of a difficult one. Africa is not going up as strong as it should be. Now, there's definitely work to be done there. So you remember your old school reports is that, no, room for improvement. I got a lot of that on my school report. So there's room for improvement here. And Pacific, this is interesting because Indonesia is part of the Pacific. And you would remember Indonesia being one of the critical new geographies going forward. But I'm going to be talking about political risk in a moment, because that's a really, really important context behind prospectivity. So who is actually spending that money? This is very, very important. And how I've differentiated that in terms of majors, intermediate, junior, and government. I added government there because 2 weeks ago at the Africa Mining Summit in Gaborone, I was challenged by a member of the audience who said governments spend the most money on exploration and are the most successful. I didn't have this slide available, but clearly they are not. And they have the wrong mindset. You need to be entrepreneurial in terms of exploration. But you see here that the biggest explorers are actually your juniors. Your majors, to a large degree, have actually outsourced your exploration to juniors. And then once they find something, it's been de-risked, they buy them out at a premium, which is good for everybody because the junior shareholders are handsomely rewarded and the majors can build a mine and get on with the kind of things they are doing. Now, here's a really, really interesting one, particularly for you being a natural resources people, is most of the exploration is taking place on late stage and mine site. Mine site means contiguous with current mining operations, and very little is being spent in grassroots exploration. Now, clearly, that means that you're not going to be finding particularly maybe major new commodity fields because you're not looking in grassroots areas. And maybe one of the reasons behind this is that it's actually much riskier doing grassroots exploration than elsewhere. But the corollary of that is if you don't do that, you might not find some of these larger deposits which the world needs in order to meet that environmentally friendly future. So you see the disconnect actually between the two. There's quite a large disconnect. So maybe the politicians want this, but if that's what you want, you've got to do the exploration and then do the mining to actually get to that point. And to do the exploration, you need funding. And that funding is not coming to actually get you to the mining in order to meet what we all want, not just politicians, but the world actually wants as well. So where is it being spent at the moment? it's mainly being spent in gold. That's probably because we're in a pretty volatile world environment at the moment, and gold is a safe haven. You can see copper, zinc, nickel, PGMs, very little in diamonds, I'm afraid. So it is what it happens to be. But everything aside from diamonds are actually showing some level of increase, but it's mostly around gold. And then if we translate that to the next place in the pipeline itself, if we look at mining project developments, on the left-hand side, you see billions of dollars, and on the right-hand side, number of projects. You can see clearly China is the lead in terms of development of natural resource projects, and India is very big too as well. So you're seeing a shift in the global economics and who will be global superpowers by the time you probably get to my age. Things will have actually fundamentally changed. And what is pleasing here is, notwithstanding some of the stuff I'm going to share with you about South Africa, is that we're gradually creeping up, which is good. So money is going into developing new operations in South Africa, and there are a number of them actually being developed. So don't always believe the negative press. I was very fortunate to have lunch with some of your colleagues, and often we get quite negative about what we have in South Africa. But if you go somewhere else in the world, you will find exactly the same problems or very similar problems there than we actually have here. So the South African mining industry, here we take a bit of a shift. I've got to give you a pragmatic presentation. I'm not a consultant, by the way. I'm a business person. So I'm not giving a consulting style of presentation, and I'm an explorationist. So I'm a half full kind of guy. So just take it from actually whence it comes. So our share of strategic minerals from a geological perspective, we are incredibly blessed with our endowment in South Africa. We have got world-beating PGM and chrome resource. We have world-beating resources actually elsewhere, and we've got some of the world's leading mining companies in those kind of commodities, and we have huge potential in those commodities too as well, of which I will share with you. So our base geology is fantastic, and the base geology of Africa is fantastic too. If you look at some of these numbers, you don't have to remember this. Now, the point about this slide here is you can take this away, have a look at the numbers. The impact of mining in South Africa is absolutely huge. You're looking at contributing in real terms 7% to the GDP in 2020, when the rest of the economy contracted by 6.8%. And thank goodness for high PGMs and rare earth prices, because that allowed the government to take the taxes from those guys to do the kind of things they actually had to do. However, we are still well below our 2000 and 2000 peak. So as I mentioned earlier on my school report, room for improvement here too, as well. If you look at the contribution by commodity, it's a very, very mixed picture here. I'm not going to go through every one of these charts, but just to share with you some of them. If you look at gold, for example, and diamonds, you look at production going up, but employment going down. And that's one of the major challenges facing South African mining companies. If you want to actually mechanize and automate to drive your costs down, it means lower employment. And that's not the kind of thing that we should be doing. We must be quite a bit smarter in terms of how we deal with that issue, about lowering operating costs, because we have to do that safely, but also creating employment, perhaps actually elsewhere. You look at other areas, you look at iron ore, production going up, employment going up. Manganese, production going up, employment going up. So non-ferrous metals as well, the same kind of thing. But it's a commodity cycle. That's where we are at the moment. And I'm basically giving this presentation in the commodity cycle as we see it at the moment, and as it will probably be for the next 2 years. So if I'm invited back again in 2 years' time, this will be probably a little bit of a different presentation. Look at my final sub-bullet here. South Africa still has over 300 years of PGMs and over 200 years of coal reserves available. It's phenomenal. And you look at the other numbers we have. So we've got a fantastic foundation to build all of this. We look at our mining exports. We provide 71% of the European Union's needs for platinum, and even a higher share of platinum group metals. But the key challenge this industry faces is the rail and port logistics blockages. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the tragic crashes on Pongola going the way to Richards Bay. It's because that road is just full of tipper trucks and trucks going to Richards Bay. If we had a really functioning rail system, it'll take the trucks off the road, make it safe for people to live in the environment, and drastically improve our exports, which would increase our taxes. So there are a few things that we need to really focus on. I haven't mentioned electricity yet. The presentation is still going. Or water, but transport is really key, particularly rail transport. If you look at the mining sector itself, the South African mining sector has a very, very long and a very colourful and a very rich history. But we are smaller now than we were in 1994. And that's chiefly because of gold mining decreasing, which does employ many, many more people relative to that in the platinum area. But it does show that there is an opportunity for us to kind of claw back some of that growth when you look at the amount of resources and reserves we actually have. Mining stocks performance, I mentioned earlier that if you're a major, your stocks have gone up on average by about 7%. Mining shares have driven the underlying performance of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, chiefly because the commodity is priced in dollars. Commodity prices have done very, very well indeed, and they've been very handsome in producing dividends, as you've actually noted. And if you have a stock exchange portfolio, I'm sure many of you have got something in mining. It's a good thing to have in South Africa. However, there has been an exodus from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. The companies that I referred to in the previous slide are the majors. There are very few true IPOs or initial public offerings for juniors. Juniors can't raise funds on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Nearly all the money for exploration and development in South Africa comes either from Canada, Australia, or the UK. And the JSE exodus represents an opportunity for it to become people coming back, people investing here, and actually driving local exploration by encouraging entrepreneurial behavior. Mining risks. I mentioned earlier, why are we not investing so much as we actually could be investing? I've got a couple of slides on this. This slide is looking at it from the mining executive's perspective, and the next slide looks on it from an investor perspective, something called the Fraser Institute study. Well, here, environmental risks, including new regulations. That's interesting because the very environmental risks from a global perspective are driving the demand for lithium, cobalt, copper, and those things. But those very risks in itself are hampering, to some extent, operations in South Africa. And then number 3, community relations and social license to operate, a very important thing in our part of the world. It's seen as a key risk. Political instability and nationalization. No one is ever going to invest in a country where you put your hard-earned exploration dollars in and you have no automatic right to a mining license. And nationalization doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be taken by the state, but there are other percentages which must go back to other communities. And then from a Fraser Institute study, why this is important, and I encourage you to go and have a look at it on the internet. It's something which the large investment houses in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, United States actually look at, because obviously they invest in countries all over the world. And my chairman has got a lovely saying. He said, "A dollar is an orphan. It'll find its own way home." And so they look at things such as the Fraser Institute study. And sadly, Africa is the second least attractive region. And my company, Botswana Diamonds, is active in Botswana and South Africa. And Botswana was the top in Africa for many, many, many years. But it's now slipped because of fears around protected areas, labor regulations, and taxation. So this is where countries actually compete with each other. There's a very good text by Peter Drucker here. I'm showing my age a little bit, about the competitivity of nations and how can you compete as a nation to encourage investment. A small little anecdote. Most of the diamond cutting and polishing industry in the region was in downtown Joburg, just 5 kilometers down here. But what Botswana did is they built a brand new cutting and polishing industrial park near the airport. They built a new 5-star hotel next door to it. They built secure access to the airport itself, and they waived VAT. So what happened is the companies which had workers here retrenched the workers here and employed them in Botswana. So there are things countries can do to make themselves actually more competitive. Again, great opportunity. So exploration and juniors in South Africa. This is where we hit the low part before we go back up at the end of the presentation. The goal, according to our DMR, is to achieve 5% of global exploration share by 2025. Well, if you look at the top graph there, we're not doing particularly well. It's good to have a goal, but you've got to do certain things to achieve that goal. It's a bit like if you want to pass your exams, you can want it as much as you want it, and you can wish for it as much as you want to. But unless you do the homework, you're not going to do it, unless you're very bright, of course. Okay. But it's not just an African thing. Look at the slide below it. We've also been declining in respect of the rest of Africa. And my final slide in a few, 3 or 4 slides later, will actually illustrate the kind of things that we can do to get to 5%, because I see absolutely no reason why we can't actually get there. So how big is the junior and emerging market sector? It's obviously nowhere near as big as the major sector. So the numbers are quite a bit smaller, but still they're very significant. Revenues of 54.4 billion, expenses of 55.5 billion, shows it's pretty marginal, but those expenses mean people are being paid, supplies are being bought for, communities are living off these kind of operations. And thankfully, juniors are to some extent exempt from what is actually quite a complicated charter. And why do I say to some extent? Is the regulations change from regional office to regional office. If you look at the number of junior mining in South Africa, if I showed this slide of junior miners in Australia or in Canada elsewhere, I'd need to probably have another 10 slides and maybe make it a 4-point font to actually put them across. There are not many here. And you'll see where they're all listed. And you will see that, as I commented earlier, they raise their funds from offshore because you can't raise funds from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. I've been trying for 17 years. I might have raised a little bit for a mining company, but not for exploration companies. It's too high risk. Now, I went to see the chief investment officer of Old Mutual once, and he said, I can't invest in an exploration company because I can't see the discounted cash flow. I said, but that's the very purpose. We're a growth stock. One of my companies, African Diamonds, returned 25 times to the original shareholders. You don't invest in an exploration company if you're looking for dividends. That's like Donkov. You do it because it's a potential growth story or not, as the case may be. So not a very large number of companies. So if you look at what commodities they're in, very active in the industrial mineral space. Very, very active. They kind of sit behind the radar screen, andalusite, roadstone, all those kind of good things. Very, very active. Very active in diamonds. We've got a very attractive diamond regime. We don't have the 10% royalty in South Africa, which countries like Zimbabwe, Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini have. So it encourages small mine development. And isn't that a success story? We've got something called a mining permit in South Africa, in addition to a mining license, which allows small-scale operators to actually run. And I often use that as a model legislation for other countries, because if you're trying to mine on a small-scale basis, applying and running with a large-scale mining license is often very, very challenging. Now, take a deep breath when you read this slide. This is some of the challenges we actually have to face. There is a huge backlog of applications. So if you are able to find a vacant area where you wish to apply for a prospecting license, it's going to take you a long time to actually get it. And I'm fortunate to compare Botswana and South Africa. In Botswana, you have a 3-month turnaround. You either get no or yes. Simple as that. There's no debate about it. And you can see who has got licenses in those areas. And you can actually see all the historical work that's been done on that particular property. You can't do that here. So room for improvement, lots of work to be done. I just have to mention this because this is something which the overseas investors see. So you can't hide away from this. This is 21 billion rand in lost tax revenue. It's 14 billion rand in gold production. It employs a lot of people illegally, and it's part of the kind of mafia society which some say we live in or not. But the key issue here is we haven't cut off the fish at the head yet. And that's what we really have to do. It's unsafe, and it's actually depriving the state of much needed revenue, which can be mined by in a way which is congruent with our legislation. It's really actually got to be dealt with. So how are we going to revitalize the industry? And we can do it. This is not something that is impossible. But before we talk about that, is that what is really important, I want to flag on this, is the fourth bullet. We started something called Section 12J. Now, this was the equivalent of the Canadian flow-through share scheme initiative. It was equivalent of the Australian and British Stock Exchange initiatives, which would basically mean that you as a taxpayer could invest in a junior stock and get a tax credit for it. Because investing in juniors is not always going to give you a good return. You could lose actually all of your money. And that's really stimulated that level of activity across those jurisdictions. I went to naively so, a 12J conference about 4 years ago, and I looked around and I was the only explorer. And Bruce Whitfield, who you may listen to on Radio 702, said, "Why are you here?" I said, 12J was designed to actually help people like me. But not one single exploration company got $1 from that scheme. It was all for high-risk investments, like opening a spur or an ocean basket. So there's work that needs to be done around that. So the idea was great. It just became too complicated. And doesn't that kind of ring a little bit of a bell? What I said here at the bottom, investor confidence can return. And how is it going to return? And here's some kind of to do things which actually do, and this is my final slide. So I'm not concluding from sunrise to sunset. I'm going the other way around. I'm saying we're kind of, it's a lovely African sunset at the moment, and I'm working towards the dawn. We need to have access to geological information. I made the comment that if you go to the Geological Survey in Botswana, or actually most countries in Africa, because that's where I work, you can go to the Geological Survey and you can get the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years of information there. So the barriers to entry are very low. You can't do it here. There isn't any, unless you're old like me and you have a very big network, you won't even know where to start. We need a transparent mineral cadastre. So you can go onto your website yourself on your phone to see who's got what and whether you can apply for something. Can't be done here at the moment. There is a very simple fix. There's a company in Cape Town which has done many countries in Africa. Give them the job possibly, and we'll have something within 6 months. It can be done. It's not complicated. It's basically a glorified GIS system. When you have a mining and exploration license, you've got to collect that data, report it to the DMR, and then they would store it for future use. At the moment, you only have environmental reporting. Yes, that's very important. I get that. But for explorers, what's more important is you providing that geological information back to the state. So when you use it or lose it, which is really important, someone else can have a go at it. Because often juniors have a very different perspective on things than majors. And there's a food chain in mining like there is anything else. A major starts with a deposit, then a smaller company takes it over, then a smaller company, and then you end up with a private industry person, and everybody makes money somewhere along the food chain. A well-trained and functional DMRE. The only comment I'm going to make here is when I introduced the Minister of Mines in Botswana at a conference about 4 months ago, I actually read his CV out to the audience, and he asked me, "Why did you do that? You should have just said the Honourable Minister of Mines." And I said, "No." I said, there are investors in the audience and they need to know what a highly competent, well-qualified, he's got his master's in Wits, by the way, minister you actually are. And he said, no, that's it's a good point, because just because you've been given the title of minister doesn't necessarily mean you're actually any good. And I think that's really important. And then penultimately, access to finance and capital flows. I spoke about the JSE exodus. I've spoken about the absence of tax incentives for investors in the JSE. There's always surprises in this country, and elsewhere in Africa. Why is it overseas money and overseas ownership taking the mines? It's because overseas people put their money in and they stood the chance of losing 90% of it or making 10 times their money. So clearly, one of the major goals of an MD or CEO such as myself is protection of your ordinary shareholder. It's actually the fundamental fiduciary duty of an executive. But we can change that. We have a very high number of high net worth individuals who should be investing in exploration in South Africa as part of their discretionary portfolio, but they're not incentivized to do it. So where do? They invest in exploration in Australia. Now, isn't that balmy? They should actually be investing here in South Africa. And finally, an efficient, cost-effective and reliable infrastructure. We all know about power. We all know about water. We all know about railways. We are blessed compared to many, many other African countries of still having much better infrastructure than they have. We need to actually start investing a lot more money into that. We're way below the curve in terms of our capital investment in infrastructure, and that must change. And that's the only way we're going to really catapult the industry and actually improve our job situation. And finally, my final strapline is we need consistency, predictability, and stability. When you go and put your hard-earned money to work for you as an investment, you look for these kind of things: consistency, predictability, and stability. So thank you very much indeed for your time, ladies and gentlemen, here at Wits. And thank you very much for that. And thank you too for those on the Zoom call. Very happy to take any questions or comments if there are any. It mustn't be too difficult, please.
Thank you very much. Actually, the Geosciences Act, which means that we have to report everything to the Council of Geosciences. And there are issues with doing the research because it's mining companies prepared to do that and pay our students to do the work and they get their fees. But that information belongs to the company, not to us, and certainly not to everyone else. So how do we tie in having a report versus doing research versus being compliant with the geoscience?
Look, you're right. It is a big elephant in the room, and companies such as ourselves far prefer the model which has been adopted in nearly every other country in the world, where at the end of each quarter or 6 months or a year, depending on your reporting period, you report your exploration results. You don't have to report interpretation. So if you're doing microprobe work on mineral grains, you don't need to kind of start plotting them and interpreting what they mean. You just provide the data. So it's actually there for everybody else. We worry that the provision of that kind of information and storage to the CGS will undermine the competitive advantage of explorers. Because after all, what is the competitive advantage of an explorer? It's actually insight, knowledge, information, access to ground, access to finances. But those first few are actually so fundamental. I've got no easy answer to that question. It's a problem. And if it's actually fully implemented, it could well turn away investors to this country.
That would be my next question. When papers of people who would invest,
yes,
they're not going to invest if they're not going to benefit the Geosciences Act for benefit.
No, they won't. There's no kind of simple answer to that. As I mentioned, what my chairman said, a dollar is an orphan. It'll find its own way home. And we may not be that home if it's like that, because if they're putting their hard-earned risk capital to work, they would want to be sure that the intellectual capital tied up in that is actually secure until they've actually lost the license or they've used the license, actually one of the two. It's a worry giving it to someone like the CGS whilst you're still exploring a particular license. It's a big worry because you have all sorts of things, potential for claim jumping and all of that happening, which is a big worry. Aaron? Karen, a very good question. I deliberately kind of kept clear of diamonds because that's my world, as you heard from Ben, this company diamonds, this company that diamonds. I think maybe a couple of things. I think the first thing is there's been a reduction in capital for exploration. That's been compounded by a reduction in the capital for diamond exploration because it's seen as being a lot riskier. And where this has come from to a large degree is that when the London Stock Exchange harmonized with European stock exchanges, they brought, post 2009, they brought on a lot of extra bureaucracy, for want of a better word, which makes it very difficult for fund managers to recommend exploration stocks. I'll give you an example. JP Morgan used to take 10% of all the diamond juniors they quite liked because they knew one of them, or they hoped one of them would kick and actually would then make their money at the end of the day. JP Morgan no longer invests in diamond exploration. So if you look pre-2009, there would probably be a dozen or so people like myself. And I think I'm the one of only 2 listed diamond explorer CEOs left in the region. We're a dying breed, to put it bluntly. And I think the second part to that is that there have been very few success stories. Now, you've got some in Canada. You've obviously got the Karowe mine in Botswana. That was an African Diamonds project, by the way. But they're few and actually far between. And that, along with the bureaucracy that's come along with the European Union and elsewhere, has actually made it very difficult to find funding for diamond projects. And therefore, that's why it's dried up to actually a large degree. But notwithstanding that, the diamond market is still doing very, very well at the moment. Essentially, it's been driven by the rise of the middle class in China and India, and the aspirational purchase of spending 3 or 4 months of your gross salary on a diamond ring once you get to that particular point. So the diamond market is actually doing very, very well, but very little money is being spent on exploration. Sounds a bit familiar with some of the stuff I was talking about earlier, doesn't it? Yeah. Thank you, Karen.
Any last questions? Yeah, one more.
I believe the phrase that is to be I just want to know what does it mean? It means 90 million.
No, it's look, it's I thought that question may come up. You can't okay, so the question here is this gentleman here, he'd read the Fraser Institute study and he says it's clearly South Africa has got major problems in terms of its investment ranking. And what does it mean as future geologists in the industry where you see these challenges? And you can't put lipstick on a pig, can you? To be honest, okay? But what you can do is people like myself and other kind of industry people out there can actually lobby the government to do the kind of things on my final slide. Because the first thing people look at as an explorer is what they call prospectivity, i.e. the geology. And if you ain't got the geology, you've got nothing. So you can't build anything actually on top of that. You've got to have the geology. And we've got the geology. So we can actually fix those things on it. So people like myself, the Minerals Council, and other fellow CEOs must lobby to get this done. You guys who are voters, I'm now a voter, by the way, as well. But you guys who are voters must vote for people who will actually do these things. So if you see the Minister of Mines, you ask him, when are you going to roll out a transparent cadastre? Why are you not providing tax incentives for people to invest in South Africa? So you must ask those questions. So there's no easy shortcut to this. by the way. That's the kind of thing. We just got to carry on going. We just got to try our best. We've got to do those kind of things and not give up hope. Sorry, I can't do better than that.
Yeah, partially answered my question in your last answer, but I think it's worth re-emphasizing. If most people in this room are going to be in industry in 3-4 years' time, what do you think is the most important thing that they can do in their lives as geologists and South Africans change or to implement that to do gathering geologists?
Look, I think I've answered that to a large degree. I think you must lobby your parliamentarians. You must ask those difficult questions. You must talk to your networks in terms of decision makers in these kind of areas. You must encourage, the older folk who have maybe larger networks to actually talk to people, to actually get the job done, but in a positive, constructive manner. Not a kind of a negative thing at all. And that's actually one of the wonderful things about almost contrasting Botswana to South Africa, is that they are incredibly constructive, incredibly positive, and listen. I got invited to meet with the president at the mining indaba. Just me, Botswana. We're a tiny little company, and it wasn't scripted. He said, just ask him what you want to ask him, and he'll give you the answers. Now, isn't that refreshing? We need to kind of move towards that kind of environment here so we can give you a future. But it's a lot of hard work, but people like me never give up. We keep going.
Okay, final question, Gilligan.
It's not a question, it's a comment. Within our relevant program, mining is there.
Yeah.
Exploration is there. What we do is hold our politicians accountable to actually meet that. It's there, and we gonna make it. We don't have to wait until other people. We certainly don't have to wait for our neighbors to come in or our colleagues elsewhere in the world. It's in our hands to do, but we need to hold our people accountable and say it's in our national development and our country depends on it. Let's do it, and let's do it together.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, thanks once again, James. Great talk.
Thank you.
Fantastic. There's a few comments from the.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. Yeah. Okay, great. Will you just send me the link? So sure. By the time I get home, I had a CD joint failure in my car. I had to take it back so it didn't fix it properly. I'd like to go and fetch my car. When I get back this evening, I might forget. That's great. Okay.
Very engaging.
I try to watch the clock. Yeah.
These are issues that we have to come
I probably asked quite loud. There's some of the background.
Yeah, there's something going on the.
No, but actually.
Oh.
I think
What's very interesting about
I came down the
very noisy. It's my tracks off the train's not quite as quick as it is.
James says, hi,
Aisha, how are you? Lovely to meet you. It's a great manager. It's great. We've been to Boston 3 years ago. Sorry, is there anything there I can do?
there was just a few comments, mostly just comments about what you were discussing, but I don't want to read through these. I'll just quickly cover it. I think okay. That was up to agreement. So, okay. Yeah. Think about local communities and assets as well. Describing floor as a established politicians. I would never do that. Yeah. Okay, that's good.